we get started here, I just want to go ahead and share my screen so that you all can see the presentation for today. Hopefully you can now all see that. If you have questions throughout today's presentation, we would ask that you please use the Q&A panel to ask those questions, and then we'll make sure that we get them answered if it makes sense throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we'll be sure to revisit them at the conclusion of the presentation, so we have some time to get those answered for you. So with that, I will turn things over to our superintendent, Amy Hawkins, to get us started.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. And we're super glad to have you join us today virtually so that you can learn more about the bond referendum that is going out to vote on November 7th here in a few weeks. So the agenda for today is really to talk about how did we get here, what's included in the bond referendum, why does it matter? Why does it matter to both of our students, our staff, and our community? What's the overall impact for our community? And then what's next? We had, so we talk about how did we get here? And really, it started with our school board. Our school board has a district facility plan that they have. It's really a 10-year plan on what they want to do with our district facilities over time. And so that's been something we've been doing it's been long-standing in our district. And as we were looking at updating doing those projects on the district facility plan, some of those things have been on there for a lengthy period of time just because we haven't had the finances to complete those projects. Then, as our state has given us low state supplemental aid, which we'll refer to as SSA, and with our community having the demographics changing in Dubuque, causing us to have a little decline in enrollment, the district really had to look at how can we save $3.5 million a year in order to keep offering the same education, the same programs, the same extracurricular that we have for our kids and give them the best experience possible. And so when we started looking at what are ways we can that we can be more efficient in our district, one of the things that came to the forefront was our middle schools. Currently, we have 3 middle schools in our district, and we found that if we would maybe go from 3 to 2 middle schools, there might be some savings in there for the district to look at how we can save that money that we need moving forward. So the school board asked the district officials to put together a middle school study. So we started that along with Envisions Architects in June of 2022, and we really looked at what happens if we go from 3 to 2 middle schools, where would that middle school be located, and lots of details went into that study. We included many people from our community, parents, students, community members, our staff, all to have input on what that would look like if we consolidated 2 middle schools. And Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that. But as we had our findings about the middle school, we really found that the price of that middle school was going to be more than the SAVE or the 1-cent sales tax dollars that we had available. And we've been using our 1-cent sales tax, just to remind you, to renovate our 2 high schools. We built Roosevelt, Carver, Prescott. We've used 1-cent sales tax in the past to do our projects. And we found that the middle school project was going to be more than what we could bond for. So that is how we got to this point where the board decided, let's combine those 2 things. Let's look at our district facility plan, our 10-year plan, and our middle school task force recommendation, and see if we can't combine some of those things and then go out to vote on November 7th so we could complete some of those projects. So when we talk about what projects are on the bond, the air conditioning, ironically, we don't have all of our district buildings air conditioned at this time. Obviously, the new middle school study and the new middle school facility is part of the project. We're looking at adding a gymnasium onto Eisenhower Elementary School, which Eisenhower has become our largest elementary school in the district at just hair under 600 students. We're looking at updating our baseball and softball facility. And then the board is really looking at being forward thinkers and to say, we want to buy a piece of land where we know there could be some population growth in the city limits or in our district limits. So the first project we're talking about is air conditioning. You can see on the screen that these are the schools that are currently without air conditioning. And along with those schools is also Washington and Jefferson Middle School. This slide shows really where in proximity are our schools with air conditioning and which schools are not. And so you'll be able to see from this from the slide that many of our air conditioned buildings are obviously our newer buildings or the buildings that we've done renovations using our saved dollars. So why does it matter? This picture was actually taken that first week of school when I think it was a record high of 100 to 106 degrees, depending on who you were talking to. But this is actually something that we took in one of our classrooms that first week of school. And it showed that the building was, that classroom was 97.3 degrees, and that's without humidity. So we know that it's really hard for our students to be engaged during this time frame. And it's also tough on our staff to work in buildings that are not climate controlled. We've also found that 97% of all houses in Iowa had air conditioning as of 2020. So really air conditioning has become a necessity. During that time, the first few weeks of school, we let out early. And not only did we do that to our non-air conditioning buildings, but we do that to our air conditioning buildings as well. So the slide says we lost 6 hours of instruction for the first 3 days. And then there was an additional day that we had to let out 2 hours early. So our students really lost a total of 8 hours of instruction that first 3 weeks of school. And so in the district, we do keep track of how many days are over 80 degrees or more. In the past 2 years, we've had 42 days because we know it doesn't have to be 100 degrees out for our buildings to keep that heat, and really tough to get that heat and humidity out of those buildings for a few days after those heat waves that we receive. And the impact is we would have students hopefully more engaged, not going home feeling like that they're exhausted. And we would have 100% of our schools air conditioned at the completion of this project. And we would not have to let school out early and have the inconvenience to our families to have to pick up kids early, when they're working and it's tough to find daycare and places for them to go in the afternoon.
So I'm going to jump in now and talk a little bit about the middle school project. And as Amy mentioned, the middle school project really started with discussions about cost efficiencies and savings. And we moved through a study in the district to determine the viability of that move. And so you can see here the goals really are to replace the more than 100-year-old Washington and Jefferson buildings, to ensure access to similar high quality facilities in all of our middle schools for all middle school students in the district, and to create a feeder system that would allow students to attend middle and high school within the same cohort. And so what this would mean is that if we moved to 2 middle schools, we would look at students who attend Roosevelt Middle School going directly to Hempstead High School for high school, and students at the new middle school would go directly to Dubuque Senior High School for high school. And when we look at the importance of that, part of that is building relationships, building affinity groups, and having those relationships be able to move forward. But a significant part of that also has to do with the demographic breakdown of our buildings. If you look at Dubuque Senior High School and Hempstead High School, you will see that in every demographic category that we track, whether that be gender, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, that those schools are as near identical as you can get for 2 buildings. And so that would mean that our middle schools then would also be representative of that, and having a very similar student demographic in all of our categories from that middle school level as well, that would then move into the high school level. This next slide looks a little bit at the current state of our facilities at the middle school level, and I want to be clear in saying that this is about the physical facilities. This is not about the education that's provided in those buildings. And you can see this was a study that was done by our partners from Envision who are on the call here. You can see that Washington and Jefferson are in the D+ and D range, and Roosevelt is in the B+. We think about Roosevelt as our new middle school in the district, but Roosevelt is 18 years old. And so it's a B+ because now it's at the point where where some of that deferred maintenance has to happen, roof work, those kinds of things have to happen to continue to make sure that that building continues to be a high quality learning facility. You can see on the side some of the challenges with those older buildings in inflexible structures, old infrastructure, small spaces, a lack of secure entryways, and really Washington and Jefferson were not designed for the learning of today. And when we look at this next slide here, this is a really good visual look at what we've asked public schools to teach over the past 120 years. And you can see on the top left corner of the screen there, in between the 1910 and 1930, that's when Jefferson and Washington opened. And then you can see when Roosevelt opened if you move farther down. But you can see the demands that have changed in public schools over the years, and really looking at the buildings of Washington and Jefferson were constructed at a time when education looked much different than it looks today. To go back to the efficiency conversation that Amy shared earlier, this is a look here. If you look at the Roosevelt side, this is the cost for us to operate Roosevelt Middle School. And if you look at the left side of that, you'll see Washington and Jefferson and the operating costs for those buildings stacked on top of each other. When we look at their enrollment numbers, these enrollment numbers were from the time of the study, but the numbers are within about 50 students when you add Jefferson and Washington together compared to Roosevelt. And it cost us $3.5 million additional to run Washington and Jefferson in a less efficient way than it does for us to operate Roosevelt. So as we look at that efficiency piece, having a building that is of similar size and structure and staff makeup to Roosevelt would lead to an estimated $3.5 million in savings. And I think it's important to note that those dollars are annual savings, that this is really our operating fund, which in the state of Iowa, our operating fund is a separate fund from our capital funds. And legally, we're not able to change dollars within that. So we're looking at ways to build that efficiency from a financial perspective in our operating fund, which is where these dollars come from. On the next slide here, you can see just a little bit of a comparison to the three middle school buildings. You see, of course, the climate controlled piece, secure entryway, which exists at Roosevelt as kind of a double entry structure. That's not possible to do at Washington and Jefferson. You can see a little bit about the site size there, Roosevelt being on about 30 acres. You can see some of the Walker-Ryder comparisons, and then that configuration for small learning communities, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. When we look at site options, it's important to know that the district and through the middle school consolidation study really went through a comprehensive look at various sites. These are the top 7 sites that were looked at. There were some others that were explored in the preliminary stage. And as we looked at that site selection process, we looked at both the Washington and the Jefferson sites to ensure that we were looking at district property. The footprint, which we'll talk about in a bit, is really where the challenge came there. But you can see some of the other sites we looked at, and in all of those sites, there were a variety of criteria that were looked at, from the size of the site to the proximity to students, to the type of land that it was being constructed on, to the location. All of those things were taken into account, and really all roads led back to the Washington site as we looked at all of the other site options had some significant red flags in them that kept moving us back to the Washington site. And so once the Washington site was determined as the location, there were really a number of approaches that were looked at. The first was to basically keep the Washington building as it is and add on a new addition. The second option was to add a new addition onto the current Washington building and then completely renovate the current Washington building. One was to build a completely new school on the site. And then one was to do nothing. That was an option that was explored by the consolidation study group. And when we look at Jefferson and Washington, we know that there are still significant costs that would need to be undertaken in order to keep those buildings viable in the future, starting just with the air conditioning and climate control. The estimated cost to do air conditioning and climate control in Jefferson and Washington is in the $25 million range. And so that's without making adjustments to learning spaces, enhancements to those learning spaces. That's simply the ability to add climate control and HVAC. And so when we look at the recommendations of the community task force, which again was made up of community members, parents, teachers, administrators, school board members, that group came back to us with recommendations that were to move from 3 to 2 middle schools, to retain Roosevelt as one of our middle schools, to look at constructing a new middle school on the site of the Washington campus, and to look at expanding that site to provide adequate amenities on the site. The district is looking at, on that site, acquiring 5 properties, 4 on the Lombard Street side of Washington and 1 adjacent property on Grandview that would allow that site to grow. To look at the development in a way that would have a nod to the history and the impact of Washington and Jefferson middle schools in our community. And then again, adjusting that middle school boundary to create that feeder system that we talked about. The next is a look here at what we call the house structure. And so when we talk about this from a facility perspective, sometimes we hear, well, boy, an 11 or 1,200 student school is a really big middle school. And we have a structure in place from both a programming standpoint and from a facility standpoint to help manage that size and making our middle schools feel small. And it's called the house structure. And so you'll see here, this is just a visual of a physical layout. And I'm going to use Roosevelt Middle School for an example. And I have 2 students who are at Roosevelt Middle School myself. And our students at Roosevelt move together in groups of about 125 students who are what we call a house. And those students at Roosevelt attend their daily classes primarily in a pod that's their house that has a math teacher, a science teacher, a language arts teacher, a social studies teacher, a special ed teacher. All of those resources exist in that small house unit. Those are the students that they take their classes with. The classrooms are all in this same physical space. And so we have 9 houses at Roosevelt, 3 in each grade level, that help us make a school like Roosevelt feel small, create those small relationships groups, create the relationships with staff and teachers so that those students not only know other students in the school, but really have that primary group that they move through their instructional day with. And it's a really, it's been a really great, successful structure for us. Now, we also have the house structure at Washington and Jefferson, but the physical setup of those houses makes it much more difficult to provide the same level of collaboration, because sometimes a house room might be upstairs and down the hall compared to one being downstairs. And so physically, those collaboration spaces aren't set up in the same way as they are at Roosevelt. The next slide is just to give you a sense of how the space would fit on the land. And so we talked about that site size a little bit. And if you look at Roosevelt Middle School, Roosevelt is about 30 acres, and that's a big footprint. When we look at the Washington site, we'd be looking at, with property acquisition, about a 13-ish acre site. And so we have to be a bit creative with making sure that we can get the building onto that site, as well as all the other amenities to provide traffic control, parking, fields, all of those things. And so you'll just see here that this really looks at how does the building take advantage of height, and putting, you can see, if you're familiar with Roosevelt, you know the gym is its own footprint, the auditorium is its own footprint. And you can see in this rendering of the spaces, this breakdown of space allocation. The green on the bottom there is gym space, which is the competition space. And then we have performance space, which is the auditorium. And then we look at how do those instructional spaces move on top of that to take advantage of that height. And so a good way to just picture this is to go to this, and we'll call this a what could be rendering. This is not a full design. This is really a look at what could the building look like. And we think that it's important to show this because when we talk about taking advantage of the height, part of the reason that we're able to do that is because of the topography of the Washington site. And so taking advantage of height doesn't mean building a skyscraper in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And so this is really designed to illustrate that component, that the way the building could work into the landscape of that building in order to allow for that height from a facilities planning standpoint, but to also recognize that it's in a residential neighborhood. When we look at the next slide, this is an example of a commons area, which could be a lunchroom. You can see just an example of how we might nod to the history of Washington and Jefferson there, but looking at providing a commons collaboration cafeteria type space that would give those modern amenities. And then when we go to the next slide, this is an illustration of that house structure that we talked about. So if you can imagine these classrooms that you see in front of you, but then also wrapping around and having this collaboration space in the middle so that students would interact in that group of about 125 students with their house. They would be in their classrooms, but then teachers and students would have access to this collaboration space for pull-out instruction, for breakout groups, to really be able to take advantage of that close relationship that comes in the house structure. And then finally, for the middle school slides, this is just an aerial to really show a couple of things. One, to show the way that the new building could fit on the site and to ensure that all of the pieces can fit within the site size, but also to really show that one of the things we've paid a lot of attention to, and our team with Envision has worked closely with the city to talk through traffic concerns, that certainly having a larger school on the site and also having an increase in busing to the site, we want to make sure that we're paying close attention to minimizing traffic on the surrounding streets and having a plan to get that traffic onto the school site. So you can see here the bus lane, similar to how we have at Roosevelt Middle School, where it's kind of the bus lane drop off in the back, parent drop off in the front, and making sure that we're working to accommodate as much of that traffic and to pull it off of the surrounding streets so that we can minimize that disruption. So we're going to move next into the Eisenhower Elementary Gym Edition. And this is a picture here of Eisenhower and the gym. And really, when we look at the importance of this piece, this is the current comparison in our district. And you can see that all of our schools over 300 students, with the exception of Eisenhower, have a separate multi-purpose room, which is the cafeteria in most cases, and a separate gym space. And so they're able to use those things simultaneously. If you're familiar with how elementary school schedules work, you know that lunch is a key driver of how the schedule of the whole building operates. And so when we look at why this project matters, we look at, this is the gym space. And so this is a picture of Eisenhower during lunchtime. Eisenhower will have gym in this space. They will, in 15 minutes, turn it into a cafeteria. They'll move 600 students through this space in about an hour, a little over an hour, and then in 15 minutes, they'll turn the space back around so that they can have gym in the space. And that puts a real strain on the facilities. The other challenge, that's a new challenge for us this year, is with Eisenhower's growth to, as Amy said earlier, just under 600 students. When you add the number of students and staff together, we actually exceed the fire code this year for the school to have an all-school assembly in the gym. And so the first few assemblies this year, we were fortunate that the weather cooperated and they were able to host them outside. And for future assemblies, they've started to do them in 2 shifts because we're not able to have the entire school in the space at the same time. So when we look at the location of that on the building, if you're familiar with Eisenhower, it has kind of an upper level entrance, and then there's a portion that has a lower level and a parking lot. So on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that gym addition in green, which would be on the lower lot area. And the structure or the positioning of this gym in this spot is intentional because after the school day, our school district facilities become community facilities. And we know that every night of the week and most weekends, our gym spaces are in high demand throughout the community for youth teams, special events, practices. That happens all the time in the district. And so this would allow us to add this gym into our rotation of available facilities for community use, for those groups to use. And you can see it's kind of set off in a way that would provide the visitors or users to that outside of the school day access to restrooms, but also allow us to keep that security of the rest of the building in place. So we would look to add this on as a community facility with that rotation and are able to do that based on the structure of the building. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to talk a little bit about baseball and softball.
Thanks, Mike. As you know, at both of our high schools, we currently have baseball and softball on each of those campuses. And when we look at those facilities, we don't have lights. And so that was kind of the biggest driver behind this. Our parents, our families, our community, they really can't get to all of our games because we do play those games at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon, which leads us into other issues with our baseball and softball fields. So if you can see on the backstop here of the senior high school field, at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon, the sun is shining pretty bright. And so it becomes a safety concern for the students or for the student athletes that are in the outfield, infield. And so really we want to look at eliminating that safety risk. And then additionally, we want to make sure that we're keeping up with our conference. If we look at the next slide, it shows how many schools in our conference have lighted fields. And if you can see, all of them have lighted fields except for the Wahlert softball field. So that really gives flexibility so we can have those games. Number one, for safety, and number two, so parents and families can come to those games and we can offer those in the evening hours. One of the biggest pieces of the baseball softball complexes, the district has done a really good job of updating all of our extracurricular spaces. If you've been in our auditoriums at the high schools, they've both been updated in the last 5 years. We've updated our football stadium, our track and field, our soccer fields. We've updated, added extra gymnasiums at both of our high schools. And then we've added the new aquatic center for our swim teams. So really finishing the baseball and softball fields would finalize our extracurricular projects. This also would give us modernized restrooms and concession stand facilities. And if you've been at either of our baseball fields, the restrooms really are not in close proximity to those fields. So having restrooms and concessions in close proximity would be a benefit to this project as well.
So I'm going to jump in here and talk for a minute about land acquisition. This is the smallest portion of the bond, but this really comes from the board and the district's desire to be forward thinking in terms of long-term needs. And so as we look at property acquisition, we look at where is the population of Dubuque growing and where is it likely that there will be a need in the future, particularly for an elementary school as the population continues to move. And we know that in Dubuque, the population is growing to the south and the west. In particular. And so trying to anticipate what that growth will look like. And I think a really good analogy for this is to look at the Washington Middle School site. So this is an aerial view of Washington Middle School in 1930. And when we think of Washington today, we think about Washington in the center of Dubuque, we think of it really in the heart of the community. But in 1930, Washington Middle School really was on the edge of town. You can see that there really is not a lot of development around the site. And then when you fast forward 20 years to 1950, you can see Highway 20 starting to go through, and some of that development is starting to happen. And then you fast forward to today, when we know that Washington Middle School is in the midst of residential property, it's in the midst of commercial property, and is really centrally located in our community. And so similarly, the district is looking to be forward thinking so that when the need for an elementary school exists into the future, we can be ready to have that land, as opposed to trying to find land after development happens, which we know is a very difficult thing to do. And so with that, we're going to transition a little bit into what the overall impact is. And Kevin's going to jump in here in a second and do that. And I'm just going to go through one more slide here, I think, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin. So this is a tentative timeline of projects. You can see this is assuming approval of the bond. If that were to happen, then this is the scaled out version of what that would look like, which really shows that middle school, the goal would be to have the first class of students in that middle school for the fall of 2028. When you look at the air conditioning and the HVAC piece, you can see that split out over 3 years. That is really an effort to look at, is there going to be contractor availability for projects of this scope and size to make sure that we can get it all done, and what does it look like to get that work done in those summers, which is really when that work will happen. And then you can see the Eisenhower gym and the baseball facility there in terms of that time breakdown. And so with that, as we get into cost, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Right. Thank you, Mike. So working with Envisions, our architects on this study, we've put together some cost estimates for each of those projects. And you can see it's ranging from $136 million to $150 million. So that's why the board has looked at and has decided to move forward with the $150 million bond issue. And I do want to clarify a couple things with that. If the projects were to come in at the low end of that, let's say they came in at $136 million, we would only bond for $136 million. And another key piece of that is what we're asking for in the bond. We can't add additional projects later on. It's strictly only allowable for the projects that you see listed. That's all we can bond for. So those two important pieces of information: A, we will only sell up to the needs of what we have, and B, that can only be those projects that you see in front of you. So why do a bond? When we looked at our save dollars and looking at the future of construction costs, you can see for this one, how much Roosevelt, when it was built in 2004, was $29 million. Today, we're looking at a similar structure, which now would cost $110 million to build. And you'll see, and that was listed back on the prior slide. Going forward, if we were to use only our save dollars, we would have to wait until near the end. And in 2047, the project would cost $289 million. Now, with the amount we take in every year and save, we will never collect enough money to meet that total amount. If we were to wait until we had all the cash available to build the project, we would never get there. The save will simply not collect that much money over that time. Next slide. So here's again a projection with all of the projects included, and you can see it goes up to $370 million in 2047. And you can see there's three different variables that are used in this model. One is at 3% cost for construction inflation, 4% is the dotted line, and then the 5% is the top line. So we looked at different variables for that. So why not use the save bonds for this? One, as I said earlier, we simply won't collect enough cash in save to do that. So another piece is we can borrow money ahead of time and use save dollars later on to pay for it, but our bonding capacity at this time would only allow us to do the middle school. It would not allow us to do any of those other projects. And we'll talk a little bit in the future slide as another reason why we're not going to use the save dollars. But that's really a big piece, is because if we were just to use the save and not bond, we would not be able to complete all of those projects. So here's a graph showing what historically our levy rate is. And by levy rate, that means the amount that the district assesses to property taxes. So you get your house and it's assessed at a certain amount, and then there's some variables and criteria that are calculated into that lower it down to a taxable valuation. And that's what the levy rate is applied to. So for every $1,000 of your taxable valuation, the district in this graph for 23-24 levels $14.51. So you can see it's the fourth lowest that we've had since 09-010. So that we're going back 12, 13 years. Going forward, what we're saying is we're going to keep that levy rate at $14.51. You ask, how is that possible? So on the left side in the 2024, that includes the three different funds that we levy property taxes as a funding source. So we have the voted pebble on top and the board approved pebble, then the management fund, and then those other colors relate to the general fund. So there's three funds that we currently levy $14.51 in total for. Moving forward, we're going to add a fourth levy to those three, and that is going to be called the debt service levy. The purpose of the debt service levy is to pay back those bonds that we're going to sell to pay for those projects. So we have to pay interest and principal on those throughout approximately a 20-year period. Why we're not going to raise the levy rate is because we have some flexibility in both the general fund and the management fund. And you ask, why is that possible? Well, looking forward for the next few years, we see a decline in enrollment, slight decline, as well as we've historically received for the last 10 years low funding from the state. We don't see that changing, so we're factoring that in going forward as well. So between those two factors, the general fund portion will decline a little bit. And the management fund, we also have some flexibility in that because we now have a healthy balance in that. So we will be able to adjust how much of the portion of the levy rate is applied to that. So that is the reason we can add, because those two are declining, we can add that fourth new levy to the top and not change the total levy rate. Also, an important factor of that is by not using the save dollars, and if, let's say, one of those other three levies changed a little bit and had to go up, we would be able to shrink the debt service levy rate and use save dollars available to pay that principal and interest. So we could lower the debt service a little bit and add some save money in to continue to make our interest and principal payments. So that's the reason we're stating that we're not going to raise the levy rate for the future. We're able to play with some flexibility in there and use the save dollars to help offset increases. This is a graph which shows the levy rate of the large schools in Iowa. And you can see Dubuque is near the 1/3 lower end at $14.51. So we will stay in that low end of those large schools going forward because of that flexibility that we have with the levy rate. Next slide.
And then I'll just jump back in, Kevin, and I know Amy is going to do a little closing here, but I just like to remind you, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you can use the Q&A tab in the Teams. You should be able to post a question there if you have one. I don't see any there yet, but certainly if you have one, you can go ahead and add that. And want to just point you to the website that we've set up to add bond information. We continue to update that. We have some more updates coming in the next day or so to make sure that we have frequently asked questions out there, to have an opportunity so that if someone has a question, they can submit a question on there and send a form in to us, and we can get back to them with the question. And really our goal right now as a district is to spread the word, to make sure that we are informing people, that we are giving them the facts of the referendum, so that they're well informed. So Amy, I will let you go ahead and close up, and then I see we have one question, so I'll wait until you're done and go from there.
I really just want to thank all of you for taking the time to hear more about the bond referendum. You know, it's really important for us to make sure that the facts are out in the community and that those facts are correct. And so anything you can do to support the schools and spreading that word. And if people do have questions, they can log into our website that Mike referenced, and there's a spot there for you to ask questions. And our district staff is doing a great job of getting back to those and keeping those Q&As on our website, so you can really look to see what the answers are and how that might relate to the school that maybe your child or grandchild is going to attend. But we know that as I'm in the community and talking with many groups and many organizations, the common theme is about how do we recruit people to come to Dubuque. Dubuque has really declined in population over time, and our demographics have changed. And we know that one thing that really attracts people to a community is a school district. And so it's our job to make sure that we're putting out the best product we can for our students and for our community. And so again, you know, we talk about this whole project started because the district has to find a way to save $3.5 million annually. And if we don't do that through the bond, then we're going to have to look at other ways to find efficiencies. And we're going to work to do that, obviously still offering the best product that we can for our kids, because we know our students and our staff and our families deserve that. So I just want people to understand that the 3.5 million is the driving force behind why we started having these conversations. So again, if you have further questions, you need something clarified, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask, because that's what we're here for, is to make sure that everybody has the facts going into November 7th.
Thanks, Amy. There are just a couple of questions here about accessing the slides. So the slides from this presentation are available on our website right now. So if you go to that dbqschools.org/bond page, there's a copy of the presentation. There is a window where the presentation should show up. If it doesn't, there's also a link right there, so you can download a PDF of the slides and have access to them. And then there's also a question about a recording to this presentation. Yes, we are recording this, and once we're completed, we will post this to the website as well, so that those who weren't able to attend are able to watch it. Seeing no other questions in the Q&A bar, thank you again, everyone, for your time. Again, as Amy said, we would certainly invite you to go to the website and submit a question if you have one, or reach out to us so that we can clarify any questions that you may have. And we're very thankful for your presence today. So with that, we will end the presentation today, and thanks again for attending.